2016 Festival of Books in Tucson, Arizona. Today we are interviewing Rae Carson, the author of Walk on Earth a Stranger. My name is Keiko, and I will be interviewing the author along with Amanda, Lucy, Mariam, Nitya, and Vanya.
How long does it typically take you to write a book?
Each book is a little different in terms of how long it takes me to write. The first one took me the longest because I was scared to write, and I wasn't sure if I would ever finish. I'd never finished a book before, so I would write, and then I would go away and not work on it for a while. And then I'd come back and be like, no, Rae, you gotta finish this. And then I would go away again. Anyways, it took me a really long time. But since then, I've been on deadline with official contracts with my publisher, and I no longer have the luxury of letting it sit and stew for a while I got over myself, you know? So I recently wrote a book in 2 months. Before that, I had written a book in 4 months, but before that, I had written a book in a year and a half. So it really kind of depends on my schedule, how disciplined I am, how exhausted I am. Each book so far has been a little bit different. So, after I've been doing this job for a few more years, come back and ask me that question again, and I might have a completely different answer for you.
What inspired you to become an author?
That's a good question. I think I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be an author. And I used to make up stories all the time when I was a little girl, and most of them were about mean parents who made a little girl do too many chores, and so finally she had enough and ran away and found out that she was really adopted and actually a princess and really special. Anyways, it was all like this bored kid wish fulfillment type of stories, but over time that gradually matured into better storytelling, and not always about my own wish fulfillment, but wanting to connect with other people. And so I think I knew from a very young age, just from being a bored kid with a wild imagination, but it took me a long time to decide to pursue it for real, if that makes sense. There's one thing to have something in the back of your head I want to write a book someday, and it's another thing entirely to sit down and actually make yourself try to achieve your dream. So that was 2 separate processes for me. Good question so far.
All right, how did you come up with Lee's superpower?
How did I come up with Lee's superpower? I was interested in doing historical fiction, but I have always written fantasy, and my first trilogy, The Girl with Fire and Thorns, was fantasy. So I knew I didn't also want to leave my roots as a creative person. So I thought long and hard about coming up with a magical twist to my historical novel that would also be thematic, that would also contribute something, that would also say something about that era. So by making her have the ability to sense the presence of gold, I was able to exaggerate and really bring to light a lot of the influences and a lot of the pressures of the era. Gold fever, this desire of people to get rich, to have a clean start, to travel a long way, thinking that there was a promised land where life would be different for me. All that I got to exaggerate and really explore by having this one magical twist.
And how have your own stances on gender roles affected this story?
That's a really good question. I actually set out to write a gold rush story from a feminist perspective. I was really excited to explore a woman's story. History has been filtered through mostly white men, and yet if you read journal entries, diary entries, women and women of color were such an important part of the westward expansion, and we never hear about that in our history books. And I was like, where are stories about people like me? So I did. I relied heavily on diary entries. There's some women who took the trip west and they journaled about it, and they are amazing. Some of the stuff that they went through, I lost a leg today, had a kid, and then I got up and made breakfast for my husband. They were amazing. And I was like, why didn't I hear more about this? And I wanted to put those women into the story so that people could see how important women were to the westward expansion.
It's really cool.
Good question. Thank you for asking. That's one of my favorite topics.
What role did religion play in the book for you?
That's another good question, because in my first trilogy, my protagonist is very religious. She's very devout, and she believes she's a part of a monotheistic religion. But for this one, I wanted to do something a little bit different. I wanted Lee to be the outlier, and Protestantism and in the South, so Catholicism were very strong influences in the culture of the day. So for her to be mainly not religious was another way of setting her apart from her peers and making her feel kind of alone. And it was a good way to explore those influences on culture from an outsider perspective. So that was interesting, because the first trilogy, I worked really hard to get inside the head of a person of faith. And for the second trilogy, it was exactly the opposite. I worked really hard to see what faith would look like to someone who maybe wasn't as devout. So,
How would you describe your writing process?
scattered, disorganized, lots of hand-wringing, probably a little too much Xbox. I tell my husband that Xbox is a crucial part of my writing process. I don't know that he believes that, but mostly I get an idea, and I get really excited about this idea, and I'll usually write the first couple of chapters in a flurry of inspiration, and this is the most amazing thing ever, and Rae, you're brilliant. And then I hit stage 2, which is crippling despair. And I realize, oh my gosh, books are actually hard to write, and now I have to, expand the world and expand the characters, and this is getting hard. And then I reach stage 3, which is learning to get over myself and to push through that. I usually take long walks with my husband, who is also a writer, and bounce ideas off of him. I do play Xbox, sometimes for inspiration or stress relief. Sometimes I'll get on the phone with my editor, and she's very helpful. Anyways, that third step for me is working through it. And then the final step is polishing it and realizing that the work was worth it, that this is turning into a project that I'm really proud of.
So, to talk a little bit more about feminism.
Let's.
Yes. So, why did you choose to include menstruation in your book when so many other authors choose not to?
Yeah, good question. Menstruation is a big part of my life. Like, I spend a fourth of my life doing it, and it's awful, it's messy, sometimes it's really painful. I'm like, why do I not see this in books, if nothing else? I mean, it obviously doesn't have to be the topic of an entire fiction book, but just to have an adolescent girl who never gets her period, to me, is so unrealistic and baffling. And I just think it's time that we stop being afraid of talking about menstruation and menstrual blood and the mess and the inconvenience of it, and start celebrating it, or at the very least realizing that it's a very normal thing that we almost all of us, depending on our parts, have to go through. And so I just felt really strongly that it's something we all do. Why don't we talk about it? Why don't we? There should be no shame, we've got to go on. And I remember this might get a little too personal, but I'm going to go there anyway. When I first got my period, it was very mysterious to me. Like, I didn't quite understand what was going on. I knew there was a thing that happened and there might be a little blood involved, but it was kind of mysterious and scary. But it doesn't have to be mysterious and scary. And if I had read some books as a teenager where it was just a part of life, I think I would have rolled with it a lot easier than I did. So, good question. Thank you for asking.
Well, I definitely agree with you.
Yeah.
And in what ways did you find it challenging to combine both historical fiction and fantasy?
Oh, that's another good question. Well, one way that it was challenging was just switching mindsets. My first series is very epic quest fantasy, like Lord of the Rings. It's like magic. It happens in a completely different world, and that was really fun. But for this series, my world was already built for me. Like, I am stuck in the boundaries of historical facts and the geography of the United States. And so it was a completely different mindset, just going from one to the other. And yet I still had to be in that mindset a little bit because of Lee's power. So that was challenging. I also had concerns about it from a marketing commercial standpoint. If I write this historical novel and it has a little bit of magic in it, will people not take it seriously? Will people think it's therefore frivolous? And will they condescend to it? And so I was really careful about writing that line of making sure her magic power was always thematic in some way, was always commenting on the happenings of the day, so that it felt like more like magical realism, felt maybe more like a literary choice, other than the fact that if I have the chance to put a dragon in a book, I'm going to do it. That's the truth. But for this book, I tried to really ride that line of making sure it was essential to the story and to the person that she was becoming. Yeah, good questions. You guys, these are smart questions. I'm really impressed.
Something that really stood out to me personally was Lee's relationship with her horse. Is there a reason you decided to emphasize this human, non-human relationship?
Yeah, that's another good question. I love animals. I'm a pet person. I've always had pets. I've never had a horse. But I do mostly rescue. All of my pets have been death row animals, And I noticed when I was growing up, we didn't have a big YA section like there is today, but when I was growing up, you would find children's books that occasionally had animals, and they almost always died. And it was to teach children about death and loss. It was like a proxy for a human, but not really. And after a while, that kind of started to get to me, like, why do animals always have to die? And so I decided I wanted to write a really close relationship between a person or an animal and her human, and have them both survive to the very end, and just use that. And I also wanted her to have a real-world connection, something that could keep her going, and even in her darkest times. So when she's all alone out there in the wilderness by herself, and maybe she hears hammers from civilization nearby, but she's not part of it at all, but she has this horse that she can take care of, and it kind of keeps her going, and that was really important to me too.
We also noticed that a lot of minor characters in your books were children. So was there any inspiration behind incorporating so many children and their specific characteristics? Yeah,
thanks for asking that. Yes, that's another thing that I feel kind of strongly about. Children are a part of life. And they're a part of life, especially for women on the trail. A lot of them, reading these diaries, they were amazing. It was the Victorian era, so they didn't talk about things like childbirth and menstruation because that was taboo. So if you read their journals, she would be journaling for months and months, and you wouldn't even realize that she was pregnant because she never mentions it. And then she drops a kid, and she's like, oh yeah, had a boy today, named him Sam. Then got back in the wagon and did 10 more miles. And that's it. That's all we hear about that, And so I just wanted to delve into that a little bit more. And like childbirth and childrearing was a huge part of being on the trail. And they were kids that were born on the trail that never knew what it like to have an original home. So that was really important to me. And then also I was a little bit bothered by some TV shows that I saw where the kids would have like these throwaway lines and they weren't even treated as human. There's a show, Angel, which is a spin-off of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where like Angel has a son and then the writers didn't know what to do with him, so they just shipped him off to another dimension for a while. And like, no, you have to have the kids stay. You have to have the kids stay in stories, even if it's inconvenient, because they're human beings too. And someday all these people who are reading my books are going to have kids of their own, or they're going to remember being kids, and I just want them to be fully humans, if that makes sense. Yeah. That was a really long answer to a very short question. Thanks, Verd.
We know that your husband is also a writer.
Yeah.
And do you guys ever bounce ideas off of each other or edit each other's stories?
All the time. And we're still married. So that's good. Yeah. We are partners in all things. And I know that some writer couples don't work the way we do, but we work very closely together. And anything I publish and anything he publishes, it's a safe bet that the other's hand has been in the cookie jar a few times. So he helped me a lot. He's actually an historian. He did master's work in history, and his research skills are outstanding. So whenever I came up against a tough question or something that I couldn't verify, he was my ace in the hole. He was the guy that helped me out, and he's really great for plotting. We go for walks all the time, and I run ideas by him, and he runs ideas by me. When I was writing my second book, The Crown of Embers, I was having some struggles with pacing. I could tell that the parts were there, but they weren't quite in the right order to make the story flow the way I wanted. I wanted it to really move. That second book should really move. And so I was really struggling with this, and he says, give it to me. I'm going to take a look at it. So he took all of my scenes and put them in a spreadsheet for me and like color coded about what each scene was doing. And by that visualization, I was able to look at it and go, oh, I just have to rearrange these parts and this is perfect. And I told him, honey, that is the sexiest thing you have ever done for me. That is amazing. So yeah, he is my ace in the hole for when I get stuck or that kind of thing.
And what is your most memorable experience as a writer?
Oh, okay. So the year that The Girl of Fire and Thorns came out, it was selected as a finalist for the Morris Award, which is the debut award for YA fiction, which was amazing. And so because of that, I ended up attending the American Library Association conference. And when I was there, this lady came up to me. She found me in the audience. She's like, "Are you Rae Carson?" And I was like, "Yeah." I'd only had one book out, so this was all very new to me, you know. And she started bawling. And she said, I'm a librarian, and I work in a library that has almost a strictly Latina, it serves a Latina audience. It's Hispanic girls coming in all the time. And this is the first time I've ever been able to give them a book that features a protagonist that looks like they do. And they love your book, they come back and they check it out and they reread it all the time. Thank you so much. And she was bawling and I was bawling. And then my editor was next to me, was bawling. It was a snot fest. But it was an amazing memory that I hold very dear, because it reminds me this is why I do what I do. You know, when a librarian comes to me and says your book is so hot in my library because my kids relate to your protagonist so much. It's like the best thing an author could ever hear.
Which character do you identify with the most?
Let's see, which character do I identify with most? In Walk on Earth, a Stranger, this is going to sound awful, it's probably Mrs. Joyner. Because she has really set ideas about how the world ought to be, and she gets really disgruntled about when people don't meet those ideals, but then later on she realizes, oh man, maybe I was the one who was wrong. And I just feel like I've had that experience so many times when I've tried to push my own ideas of morality on someone else, only to find out, you know, I was the one with the closed mind who needed to give someone a chance. And that's what she ends up doing by the end of the book. You know, she kind of starts to loosen up and accept some other people, and I really empathize with that, because I feel like I've had that experience a lot.
Did this time period, the gold rush, have any significance to you? Like, what made it appeal to you?
Well, I'm from California, and about 9 years ago I went east to Ohio to marry my husband, whom I had met online. So I kind of did like an opposite westward expansion trip. We drove, like he flew out and we threw everything that we could possibly fit into my car, and we drove across country to Ohio. And I remember just looking out the window, thinking about people doing this in a covered wagon, and thanking every deity ever that I had ever heard that I did not have to do this in a covered wagon over the course of 6 months, and that we got to do it in a week, you know? So that was kind of the seed of it there. But later on, as I was in Ohio and it was getting colder and colder and I was missing my home state desperately, I started thinking more about California, and I started thinking maybe it'll be like therapy to write a book about California. And I still didn't write it then. It was like years before I felt ready, because this idea was too big. It was too important. I wanted to bring in the feminist aspect. I wanted to do a light fantasy aspect, and it was too hard for me to handle at that skill set that I had at the time. So even though the seeds of the idea came early, the writing came later, if that makes sense.
So, how has your own cultural background affected the diversity of the characters in the book?
Yeah, good question. I come from a migrant family. We were a Trail of Tears family and an Oklahoma land rush family, and then we moved from Oklahoma to California during the Dust Bowl. So there's this really strong ancestral cultural memory of being a migrant family that never belongs where they're at, that has always been displaced. So that was part of it, and part of that is that culture of my ancestors all come from that area, the Georgia, North Carolina, and then to Oklahoma, and then to California. So my family did that, and it's part of our culture and our heritage. But in addition to that, my brother married a gal from Mexico, and so now all of my nieces and nephews, they don't look like me. They look like POCs. They have dark skin and dark hair, and And it was really important to me to put people in my books that my nieces and nephews would grow up one day and say, she looks like me. So, and I did that with the Girl of Fire and Thorns trilogy, and I just feel so strongly about that. And I know as a privileged white author, I get it wrong sometimes, but my intent is to be inclusive and for those kids to see themselves in my books.
The scene in which the wagon caravan discovered that Lee was actually a girl stood out to us. What did you feel when you wrote that part?
That's a good question. You know, when I first started writing this book, I actually thought that scene was going to be more dramatic and more awful than it was. I thought that in the Victorian era, if a girl was discovered to have been fooling everyone by dressing like a boy, that she'd be tarred and feathered and run out of town, you know. But my research just didn't hold out. It turns out that there was a lot of cross-dressing on the trail, just from the sense of practicality. These people didn't have the amount of clothing, they didn't have closets full of clothing like we have today. You know, a lot of them made their own clothes, and they maybe had 2 dresses, a good one and an everyday dress. So if they got ruined, that was it. So, you know, say, you know, Sally Smith on the wagon train, her husband dies of cholera and she ruins both of her dresses. So what does she do? She wears her husband's clothes the rest of the way. And that was okay. Like, people understood that there were practical considerations. And they probably side-eyed Sally Smith. I'm totally making up this Sally Smith person. They, you know, and they probably wasn't ideal in their eyes, but it was actually very common. And in fact, there are journal entries from women who dressed in bloomers. You know what bloomers are? They're like fancy pants that are kind of feminine looking. It was like a compromise of the day, a way for women to wear pants but still be distinguishable as women's clothes. And they wore them the whole way from start to finish. So I kind of had to change my preconceived notions about that. And that scene was originally going to be really flashy and everyone was going to start hating on her. And instead I decided to just have everyone kind of accept it. After that initial shock, everyone was just kind of like, okay, because that is as historically accurate as I could make it. Yeah.
Okay, there was an excerpt that really stood out to all of us, actually. It's when Lee is interacting with the priest.
Oh.
My jaw dropped open. This is even worse than Jefferson's proposal, and Jefferson had the excuse of no experience. A miraculous affection? Finally, I find words. Oh, hell no. If you want to speak to that.
Yeah.
What you were feeling when you were writing that.
Yeah, I went back and forth. I'll be very honest on whether I should say the word hell in this book. Because up until this point, it was really like the language was almost middle grade. Like, she has even a younger perspective than some of my other characters in previous books. And I thought, this is going to put it firmly in YA instead of middle grade. Like, do I do this or not? But I felt like the moment deserved it. Because I felt like this is a moment when she's realizing, I'm being used and condescended to by men. And I'm not going to take it anymore. So it kind of represents not just that moment, but the fact that Jefferson hadn't like really been clear with her, and her uncle was awful to her, and some of these guys on the wagon train. And so this is kind of like this cumulative moment of, I'm standing up for myself. So I put it in there. The word hell is in my book. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you give us any hints on what you have in store for the characters in the next book?
Sure. Like a River Glorious comes out in September, and it's so close to being done. We just have some very minor edits left to do. Well, Hiram, as you know, is not completely gone yet. He was surprised to find that she had this new family now, but he's going to recoup, and he's going to come up with a new plan. So he is not gone. Early on in the book, she starts to establish this new community, and they are like founding a town in California. But it turns out that's kind of that's kind of messy because it's not really their land, you know? And it's also messy because they know that once Hiram knows where she is, he's gonna know that that's a rich place to be. So there are all these issues, and so even though it seems like everything's going well, she's waiting for the shoe to drop, and of course it does. And so the other thing about Like a River Glorious is even more than in the first book, her perception, her worldview gets busted wide open as she sees the plight of the California Indians, and she starts to see the plight of the Chinese workers in California. And she starts to come face to face with her privilege. And there are a couple times when some people really call her on some BS that's really hard for her to take. So even more than the first book, this one kind of blows her mind wide open. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Oh, and things with Jefferson kind of heat up a little bit. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Ladies, these were fantastic questions. Thank you so much. Very smart.
Cool. Yeah. So now, actually, the group can come out and